Thank you very much indeed for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. Apologies for not being there in person. I would like to be, but have young kids, and so I have to balance how much time I spend away, particularly as with all of us over the last 2 years, they're a bit more used to seeing me, which is probably not so good for them, but I like it. So I'm going to speak about mental health, moral injury and healthcare staff. You've heard my introduction, so I don't need to go into kind of who I am. For those of you who do Twitter, that's my Twitter handle, and I try and pump out our academic papers on Twitter when I can. And I guess that my real interest in terms of mental health at the moment, and has been for many years now, is about the interface between mental health and well-being and people's ability to get on with their lives and particularly do their jobs. And that's really where sort of my interest comes from. For those of you who are into academic papers, these are various websites that, and I'm happy to make the slides available if you need them. But this is our King Centre for Military Health Research website where we put all our papers up, and this is our Health Protection Research Unit website. So there's no doubt that during the last couple of years that many of us, particularly healthcare staff and other groups who have been frontline or key workers, have been exposed to a whole range of stressors. There's been trauma, lots of that, you know about that, you've read the newspapers too. The workload and shift patterns have changed. Many of us have actually ended up working more, even though in a different way. We've all had to live through home life stresses, which hopefully are now much more normal and usual than they usually were before. And there's this particular topic which has really been highlighted, although it's been around for a long while, which is the topic of moral injury. A moral injury describes the profound distress that individuals experience when they come up against an incident or an event that strongly clashes with their moral or ethical code. Now, most of the research up until relatively recently had looked at military personnel who often get put in positions where they had to make a decision in very short time about do they do A or B, and if they get that decision wrong, then people get seriously injured or killed, and they don't always have as much information to make those decisions as they would want, and that sometimes has left military personnel having done things that they shouldn't have done, or having stood back and watched events that they wish they could intervene with. And the three ways that people experience moral injury are through omission, so where people don't do things. Classic example, again, military-wise, would be that the rules of engagement don't allow you to go into a particular area to protect the locals, but yet you see unpleasant atrocities going on, but there's nothing you can do about it. In healthcare settings, it would be staff who were perhaps caring for multiple patients at any one time. And that meant that if someone was in need and there was only one person to provide that care, that they couldn't be in that second place at the same time. Acts of commission, so things that you do which you wish you hadn't done. Many healthcare staff have been put in positions where they've been asked to provide care which they're not really ideally trained for, and so sometimes that means they don't do the things they should do, and that has led them to feel morally injured. And then the last piece is feeling betrayed or let down, feeling that people who you should have been able to trust, who should have had your back, weren't looking for that, and weren't doing it. So omission, commission, and betrayal. Now, moral injury itself is not a mental illness. So you'd have heard of depression, you'd have heard of generalized anxiety disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder, lots of different diagnoses. Moral injury is not in the diagnostic textbooks. But what we know is that it is linked to post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD, depression, and also to suicidality. We've done a very careful analysis of this, and that comes up repeatedly. So moral injury is important because you can see it as a risk factor for significant mental health problems. When we look at moral injury, potentially morally injurious events, so things that happen that cause you to feel that your moral or ethical code has been breached. When we look at that in healthcare workers, we find a very useful and finding, which is where we've looked here. These are different healthcare workers. They come from a big study called NHS Check, which has got 25,000 NHS staff across 18 trusts in England. And what we did here is we asked them about their general mental health, anxiety, depression, and PTSD, different colors you can see there. But we also asked them about their exposure to potentially morally injurious events. And you can see here, it's the group who had the highest exposure that had almost a doubling of the rates of probable mental ill health. So if you've got people out there who are talking constantly about it wasn't right, I didn't do the right thing, I felt let down, I just stood back and watched, I couldn't intervene, those people are at significantly increased risk of having mental health problems. So this tells us that in healthcare staff, moral injury is a really important concept, and we need to know something about it and what to do about it, importantly. This is our NHS check study. I mentioned it's got 18 trusts across England. We started collecting data in April 2020. We've been very interested to try and find out what the impact of the pandemic was on NHS staff. Overall, we find very high rates of self-reported mental health problems. So this is a measure called the PTSD checklist. It's a short measure. And you can see here that up to a third of staff at one point were reporting having trauma symptoms sufficient that you might think they have PTSD. Now, we've done since this a very careful interview study where we've interviewed people and given them this questionnaire to make sure that we can absolutely be clear about what the real rates are. And we find the real rates are about a third of these. So they're around 10%. And what that means is you think, well, 10% doesn't sound very many. So in the general English population, about 4% of the general population probably have PTSD. So what we're finding here is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that healthcare staff are about twice as likely to suffer with PTSD. And if you ask them about it, many of them report lots more PTSD symptoms. So you can see this as a symptom measure rather than a disorder measure. But about a quarter have been involved in significant, potentially morally injurious events. And we have to say here, healthcare staff is not just frontline clinicians. We are also talking about all those amazing staff who make up the NHS, so including porters and administrators and HR professionals and all the rest of the people that we need in order to provide an effective NHS service. When we ask people about NHS staff, about what they use, what services they used, people often said, oh, we went and got some help when I felt particularly distressed, but it was a one-off. So they'd have one conversation with someone, and mostly that conversation was had with peers. Mostly people preferred to speak to their colleagues who were like them, rather than coming to people like me, or maybe people like you. And so there was a great need to try and speak with colleagues about what was going on. You may or may not be aware that over the last couple of years, the NHS as a NHS England and Improvement have made a whole range of national resources available. So these are counselling lines and text-back services and wellbeing rooms and apps and all this kind of stuff. However, the reality is most NHS staff didn't know these things existed. So although there was lots of emails and lots of little cards and posters put around, most people didn't know them. What they did know a bit more about, but still not very much to be fair, were things that their local trust provided. And mostly they had known about this because of email, but they kind of felt, well, it didn't really apply to me. They'd seen this poster, but it wasn't something that I needed, and therefore most people didn't make much use of them. Now, across these 18 trusts, we did find some examples. We're not naming names, of trusts where people actually did feel that there was a real effort to provide them with support. But I have to say that was the exception rather than the rule. And mostly, people's decision about whether they might seek sort of supportive help was very much defined by what their line managers and what their culture was of their organization. So if you had a team that said, we look after each other, that's great. But they said, because that means we don't need to use other help, that's not so good. And many people in the NHS felt there was this culture of stoicism, which I have to say our other research, and we've done lots of research, shows that this isn't just about the NHS. It's not just about the military. It's not just about the police. This is certainly a Western approach, is that there is this culture that you just crack on with mental health problems and you don't treat them in the same way that you might treat physical health or problems. And sadly, for those who did decide to access services, this is now sort of a year ago, so I don't want to paint this too much of a current picture. Many felt that it was hard to get to where they wanted to go. The referral process was slow, and then you often had these barriers to have to go down some corridor and go to some place you didn't know, and there was had to take time off. It was all very difficult. Now, we've also done another study, which is looking at intensive care workers. So obviously during the main phases of the pandemic, the intensive care staff were really very much at the front line. And what we did here was to measure, this is a scale which measures traumatic stress symptoms. So this is where you have a very high threshold. So these people have almost definitely got PTSD. And here you've got sort of traumatic distress, and you've got possible traumatic distress here. So there's three ways of looking at this at trauma, but the key thing here is to look at the pattern rather than what the actual levels are. And what you see here, this is July 2020, this is January 2021. You can see that actually when we started measuring here, the pandemic, the first wave was on a decline. And the good news is that you had lots of distressed people, but actually that distress tended to get better. Before then we had the second wave, didn't we? Or the big wave in end of early 2021. And you can see here that the rates of traumatic distress substantially increased again, and then began to come down as things get better. So the two things we can take away from this graph is that actually many people, when they're going through the thick of it, describe symptoms that could appear to be mental health problems, but in fact they're not, they're distress. And we don't want to pathologize distress. It's really important we don't label someone who's having a tough time as someone who's ill. But we also know that some of those people absolutely are ill. And this level at the bottom here represents probably what true illness is. And you can see here that there is a significant proportion, maybe some 10%, again, what we find in our interview studies, of NHS staff who have probably got PTSD. Now, if you've got 10% of staff with PTSD, those staff are not going to be providing good care. They're going to be having rubbish lives. And so actually, this is not just about looking after your staff, which is really important. It's also about, can you provide the care that you need to provide, particularly important when you're in the middle of a pandemic. So the worrying thing here is there is a significant proportion of NHS staff who have a mental health disorder that's likely to impair their ability to deliver their good care. So the question is, what on earth do you do about all that? Well, lots of evidence that we managed to collate from our military data, but also to confirm that it was useful in NHS staff as well using our study. So first of all, lots of evidence that buddying up makes a difference. So on a shift, it's very easy to say, well, Peter and Sandra look out for each other, but that makes it quite difficult. What does look out mean? How do you operationalize that? So buddying up is saying, well, Peter and Sandra, part of your job today is every hour you are meant to spend a couple of minutes looking out for each other. So I want you to check in, I want to see how you're doing, I want you to have a conversation about your well-being at that time. And if there's any problems, sort them out. And if you can't sort them out, then bring them to your supervisor. So formally making buddying up as part of what you do. Don't know if you scuba dive, but if you scuba dive, before you jump in the water, you do a buddy check. And you go over, you check the other person's kit, and that's what you do, it's standard practice. Well, psychologically, if you're in a tough environment, groups, so having a supervisor who was able to speak to you about your mental health makes a really substantial difference. Taking that information, what we did is to design a brief package of training for NHS staff when the pandemic happened. Clearly, everyone was very busy. There was no opportunity to take staff away for a half a day or for a whole day. So we designed a 1 hour training package. It's now 1.5 hours. We delivered a bit more to it, but this was called REACT. And what REACT stood for was recognize, engage, actively risk, and talk about a specific plan. We delivered this over Zoom. So we had a sort of 15-20 minute lecture and a bit of a demonstration. And then we got people practicing in breakout rooms how to have these conversations. And what we're aiming to do is to replicate that previous data and to upskill supervisors to have these psychologically savvy chats. We did a small evaluation of this, and we found that before the training, over half of the supervisors didn't feel confident to speak to their staff about mental health. 1 month after the training, 85% felt confident. So that's a really substantial shift in the people's confidence in speaking about mental health with their staff from a 1 hour bite-sized intervention. So there really is no excuse for saying, oh, we haven't got time to train all our supervisors. You know, we're not talking about very much training to really substantially increase people's confidence. Another thing we know makes a big difference is peer support. And I've mentioned a few times that people much prefer speaking to their colleagues than they do to people like me. And what peer support should do is to provide a listening ear, some very basic interventions. And this is not talking about psychotherapy. This is far more talking about solving problems, identify people who are at risk, and get those people to professional help. And this was a paper we did 10 years ago now, a Delphi study, which is, you have lots of experts who look at this particular topic. And one way that this is done is through a program called TRIM, Trauma Risk Management. And this was a peer support package that we first originated back in the late 1990s in the Royal Marines, when I was part of that great group of troops. And we basically recognized that in order to make the troops access support, you couldn't have lots of professionals flying in. So instead, what we did was to upskill the Marines to be able to speak to their colleagues about psychologically traumatic material, because obviously Marines end up getting involved in that. We have now published 15 papers. We've done lots of research on TRIM since that. And the last paper came out was one that we didn't do, which was actually quite good. So, you know, it's completely unbiased. It was done last year looking at using TRIM in Northampton hospitals. And they again, were very positive. There's over 50 NHS trusts now who are using TRIM. And the idea is to train up frontline staff who have their normal job, how to have these conversations with their colleagues and identify people who might have problems, to solve those problems where you can, to engage with management, and where that doesn't help, to make sure that individual gets helped to get the right support. And it's used now by a whole range of, you know, BBC, Foreign Office, train companies. I won't go through them all, but lots of organisations that predictably put people in challenging situations. This is how the TRIM checklist works. So this is what we train people. It's a 2-day course. These are 10 risk factors that we know increase the likelihood that people will have mental health difficulties when they've been involved in trauma. So for instance, people who've got poor social support, or people who are blaming others about what had happened, or people exposed to potentially morally injurious events. And the TRIM interview with a colleague is trying to identify whether these risk factors are present, and if they are, it's about managing it, monitoring people, and getting them to the right support if they need it. Another way that TRIM has been really useful, particularly over the last couple of years, is to help with what's called type 2 traumas. Now, the type 1 trauma is, you know, a good example would be the Manchester bombings, or the London Bridge attacks, or a road traffic accident, a single event where you know that that event has the potential to cause traumatic stress symptoms. And someone can go from functioning pretty well to not functioning very well quite quickly. Hopefully within an organization, you can spot that pretty well, because, you know, Bob the Builder starts smelling of alcohol and being shouty when he wasn't like that before. What's far more challenging is what we call type 2 trauma, which is the regular traumas that people pick up on their day-to-day jobs. So we did a review some years ago on people who work with abused children. So that involved healthcare workers, but also involved police officers and child social workers and a range of other professionals. And what you find there is actually their day-to-day work is traumatic. And so it's very hard sometimes for them to recognize which of the traumas it was that might have affected their mental health. But they go gradually downhill. Every time someone says, how are you doing? Bob says, oh, I'm fine. And of course, you know what FINE stands for, which is fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. So Bob may well have been fine, and that's clearly not very helpful. And then what happens is something small happens. You say to Bob, I'm going to move your chair from here to here, or I'm going to make this small change. And Bob says, do you know what? That's it. I've had enough. I'm out of here. And everyone's saying, I wonder why Bob's so upset. It was such a small thing that we said. And the reason Bob gets so upset is Bob's been going downhill for a while and no one's really spotted it. So this type 2 trauma is really important, particularly in healthcare and social care and lots of other settings which predictably expose staff to trauma. And the thing about TRIM is useful there because TRIM practitioners, the people who are trained in TRIM, are there in the workplace as well. They don't have to wait for this sudden big trauma to happen. They are there to have conversations and spot people who are going gradually downhill and have those conversations. TRIM practitioners are not counsellors, they're not therapists, they don't go around giving people group hugs, don't use scented candles. Some of our Royal Marines do funny things with those, but that's another story. But this is not meant to be a pink and fluffy thing. This is meant to be a very practical way of having a conversation with someone who's been through a tough time, identify if they've got a problem, and to get them to the right support or help. And as I say, we've now got lots of academic publications on this showing that this is an effective and useful way of doing that. What we should not be doing, though, is we should not be doing what's called psychological debriefing. And so there was a move probably back in the late 1980s to get mental health professionals to come into workplaces where people have been traumatized, to do psychological debriefing, to somehow talk to them and counsel them to make them better in the immediate aftermath of a trauma. We know that that is a very bad idea, not just because it doesn't work, but actually on balance, it stands a chance of making them worse. And our NICE guidelines on the management of PTSD are very clear that we should not be doing psychological debriefing. So the role for mental health professionals in the aftermath of trauma is not to come in with a Superman or woman outfit and sort of save the world. It's to be there to pick up the few people who unfortunately develop an illness, and also to support the team and the supervisors to do the right thing. And so there often is still this kind of knee-jerk feeling that we must go and debrief people and get professionals in after trauma. That's not what we should be doing. What really helps is to have a supervisor who can actively manage you. And what does that mean? Well, the process used to be called forward psychiatry when it was done in a military sense. But it's very, very practical and very applicable in very non-military settings. So the approach is called PIES. And what this really refers to are these 4 different principles. I'll run through it in just a second. And the idea is to try and ensure that people are properly managed to help them stay at work, but also help with their mental health in the longer term. The Israeli military did a 20-year follow-up study after the first Lebanon war in 1982, and they found that they had lots of people then who had acute stress reactions, and they provided them with the PIES principles, and they found the more the PIES principles put in place at the time that they became distressed, the better their outcome was 20 years later on. So the P principle is the principle of proximity. And that says if someone's having a tough time, you don't just say, well, go away and sort yourself out, or go home and come back when you're ready. Instead, what you do is you provide them with more support in the workplace, and you temporarily reduce or alter their duties so that they're not in the most stressful situations. Back in the early part of the pandemic, I ran the London Nightingale mental health strategy. And what we did there was take people off the shop floor and put them into the don and doffing stations. So that's where they put on and took off the PPE that staff needed. That was a useful task. It wasn't traumatic. They felt useful, but they weren't exposed to the most unpleasant materials. And it's really important you keep people at work where you can, with more support and with temporarily altered duties, because then they get the support they need. And we know that most people get support from their colleagues. And also, if you send them home, they worry what other people think of them, thinks of them, and they feel that they kind of, let the team down. Immediacy says if someone's got a problem, going back to that type 2 trauma graph, don't wait until they've hit the buffers before you have a chat to them. You want to nip things in the bud. You want to have having psychologically savvy conversations early on, so you can spot problems and solve them before they become a crisis. Expectancy says that if you've got people who are having a tough time and they're in the middle of a difficult situation, don't label them as being unwell. Many people have symptoms. I showed you that graph of intensive care workers, and what that shows is that over time, many people who are distressed actually improve by themselves. So the expectancy is actually, this is a tough time, we're okay, we're in this together, and you're probably going to be getting back to how you were beforehand when things improve. The other side of expectancy, though, is that if you don't improve, then we're going to make sure that you get the right professional help. And the last bit is the bit of simplicity. So if you've got an NHS member of staff and they're having to use a piece of equipment that they're not used to using, and they're really anxious and distressed about it, they don't need a psychiatrist. They need someone to mentor them and to show you how to use that piece of equipment properly, because that makes the difference. If you've got someone who hasn't had a day off in 10 days and they're tired and they're knackered, they don't need a referral to mental health care. They need to have a day off and a good night's sleep. My American colleagues have got a great phrase, which is 3 hots and a cot. 3 good meals and a good night's sleep is often the best form of psychological first aid that most people need. And we many times go to bed very worried about lots of things, and we wake up after a good night's sleep and we can't really remember what it is we were worrying about. And then sort of moving to the future, we don't just want to make sure that staff in healthcare settings, or indeed any other settings, just don't become unwell. When organizations and individuals go through adversity, the most positive outcome is what we call post-traumatic growth, which is this concept that describes a positive psychological change that occurs as a result of struggling with, or at least experiencing, highly stressful life circumstances. This is back to the days of Nietzsche, and anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And although there's a bit of a debate about how much distress you need to experience to then have post-traumatic growth. What post-traumatic growth does do is leave you and the organization in a much better position to cope with the next adversity. And actually, our data from our NHS check study shows that many people actually are experiencing post-traumatic growth. But of course, unfortunately, they're not talking about it much. So the newspaper articles that we see from the Daily Horror or the Daily Mail or whatever daily horrible newspaper you might read, they're always about doom and gloom. And the narratives of people who say, do you know what? And I've seen plenty of these people. I couldn't believe I could do it, but actually I could, and it's pretty amazing what I can achieve. Those stories, unfortunately, very rarely come through. So things that you can do to try and help organizations recover from disasters and adversity and also encourage post-traumatic growth. The first of these is to make sure that you say a proper thank you. Now that might sound, pretty simple, but going back to that moral injury piece, the moral injury piece is often there because what has happened to someone doesn't make any sense. So I put in all this effort and all I get is, oh, you shouldn't park your car in the car park over there anymore, or you didn't do this right. And so a proper thank you can make a huge, huge difference. And there are some fabulous examples out there of NHS trusts who have written to workers' children saying, thank you so much for letting your mummy and daddy come to work. We know it's been really difficult for you, but they've done an amazing job and we really needed them. So the idea here is to try and create this sense of we were all in it together. Because if you can do that, then actually people can create some meaning. Even if you didn't always have the right outcome that you might want, what it was a team of people doing their very best in very difficult circumstances. And also, if you write to people or you communicate with people, that's another opportunity to remind them of all the various supportive services that are available. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the NHS now has 40 mental health and wellbeing hubs across England, which are set up to provide staff with professional mental health assessment and support as well. But at the moment, once again, they're not being used particularly well. Another thing is to make sure people have the right time off. So when everyone's very busy, there's often this tendency to think, well, we can't give people time off because if we do, then we can't catch up on our services, or we've got so many things to do. And the difficulty there is actually it's a bit about the hare and the tortoise, is that in the short term, yes, you get more done. But in the long term, you actually lose out because staff leave, they get burnt out, they get disillusioned, and they can sometimes even become unwell. And so what you want to making sure is that people do take those days off that they're entitled to. And this is also an opportunity where people can begin to look back about what it is that they've been involved in. And there's sort of great evidence from military deployments, but also from looking at populations that have been in sort of war-torn environments. At the moment, we can obviously look at Ukraine as an example of that, but looking back to sort of Iraq and to Syria and Lebanon and those sort of countries, the work that goes on there research-wise shows that actually when you're in the middle of a really difficult situation, people adapt, they get on with it. They develop ways of coping with adversity that you wouldn't think that you could do. But that once the situation improves, you then have to reflect on that. Otherwise, there's a potential for you to become unwell because of things that you had to do in order to stay well, even if those sort of things don't really fit with the way that we normally go about our lives. And then in terms of moral injury, what we know very strongly now, our data shows, is that actually the core of it is, as I said earlier on, is this makes no sense. And this, in a team setting, has a great potential to leave people feeling either very much like they're a perpetrator or very much like they're a victim. And that's not helpful for team functioning, and it's not helpful for the individuals within a team's mental health. So what you need to do is to have reparative, reflective practice at a team level. Now, some of you may have heard of Schwartz rounds, which are an example of this, but you don't have to do Schwartz rounds. And the idea here is that you get a team who's been through adversity together, and you want them not just to talk about how do we do it better next time, although that's important. What you want them to do particularly is to talk about the impact. What was the impact of that on me? And if this is done led by a supervisor or leader, it can be incredibly powerful. And we use this acronym just as a way of how you structure a reflective practice session. What happens is FINE, F-I-N-E, facts, the impact on how are people functioning now, and then how do we look towards the future. So if you've got a supervisor who starts off by saying, look, I have to just say that I feel completely terrible. Over the last 2 years, I have asked you to do all this work. I haven't given you the right equipment. You often haven't had the right training, but yet I've expected you to carry on and do all those amazing things you've done. And I feel really terrible about it, because I think I shouldn't have asked you to do it, but I felt I had no choice, and I am sorry. And that makes me feel terrible, because that's a starting point for the team going, gosh, the boss isn't just an unpleasant person telling us to get on with it. They had to make difficult decisions too. And then what you are trying to encourage is people to share their stories of impact, not as an aim to be therapeutic in the session, but for people to realize that even if you weren't always in the same boat, you were absolutely in the same storm. And you're aiming to create this story, this meaningful narrative, which ends up with, we were a team that was in a difficult circumstance, and we were all doing our best. And it doesn't mean that I necessarily think that the other person's a great individual, but I can kind of see where they're coming from, and they can kind of see where I'm coming from. And many people who don't talk about these sort of events really harbor a great sense of resentment or anger or shame or guilt about their own feelings. And I certainly think that in terms of moral injury, there is a great place for chaplaincy and clergy staff to try and help people with these difficult issues, because these aren't things that we ordinarily talk about. I went to a very senior reflective practice session a couple of weeks ago, and there was a senior member of staff whose name I'm certainly not going to mention, talking about how they felt absolutely terrible about what they had done, but they hadn't really ever talked about it, because they'd never had a forum in which they felt they could talk about it without being criticized or without becoming too emotional. And they talked about it in this particular environment anyway. And the aim here is to create this, we're all in it together, to reduce the stress of people within the groups, and also to improve working relationships. And this is part, I think, on the process of getting towards organizational level post-traumatic growth. And then we come on to supervisors. There is a huge role for supervisors, not just to deal with day-to-day difficulties, but to try and look about how we include junior members of staff in going forward. So supervisors should be regularly having conversations about, how are you doing? What can we do to help? This is often called health promoting leadership. And there's a paper here published last year. It's military, US military, but it showed, unsurprisingly, that if you had a leader who was asking about you in an honest and genuine way and looking to try and solve your problems and make your situation better, that led to a substantial decrease in the chance that those staff will become unwell. But we have to give supervisors the right confidence and skills to have those conversations, because certainly in healthcare settings, you can be the best intensive care nurse in the world, but it doesn't mean you're very good at speaking to people about their well-being. And many senior staff, as I showed you earlier on, when in that data, don't feel confident to have those conversations without knowing how to do so. And then we need to keep an active eye on people. So there are NICE guidelines, our National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, say that we need to make sure that people who have been exposed to traumatic and difficult situations get monitored. And that doesn't mean by giving them out lots of questionnaires. What it means is by supervisors and colleagues keeping an eye on people. So if someone comes up and does something they shouldn't have done, or they act in an inappropriate way, the first starting point shouldn't be, why'd you do it? It should be, how are you? Because actually people act out of character quite often because they're very stressed, or maybe because they're mentally unwell. And what we need to do is to have a low index of suspicion that people's behavior, which is not up to par, may be down to their mental well-being. And that requires an organization to be compassionate and kind in the first instance, and not to be slack, not to allow standards to drop, but not to see everything as disaster and discipline, but to see that actually sometimes people's mental health pops up in ways that you'd rather that didn't happen. And then lastly, where people are unwell, there should be an easy access route to getting professional mental health care. And that mental health care has to have return to work as a key treatment outcome. It's not just about improving symptoms, because we know that actually if you get people back to work, even difficult work, that's generally good for their mental health. Work is a great source of self-esteem. It's a source of income. It stops people falling into poverty. It's a sense of routine. Work is not a bad thing. Although we often moan about our work and talk about difficulties, the fact is that people who are in work have substantially better mental health than people who are not in work. And so therefore we need to do everything we can to enable people to remain at or return to work wherever we can. So My conclusion of my talk then is that we shouldn't over-medicalise normal distress. People who are doing difficult tasks in challenging circumstances are likely to have some symptoms. In most cases, those symptoms will improve by themselves, but we need to adopt a nip-it-in-the-bud approach. If people have got difficulties, we should not be waiting until they reach crisis point. Unfortunately, because of stigma and for lots of other reasons, people don't often put their hand up and ask for help. Therefore, we want to encourage and proactively ensure we nip things in the bud. We should do that by building team support, not flooding areas with lots of therapists and counsellors. We need some, but not huge numbers. What we need are supervisors to be able to have psychologically savvy chats and peer support available where people are doing tough stuff. Those PIES principles are really important. Active management of people within the workplace has a much better outcome than simply saying go off sick and come back when you're better. And we need to have a plan that doesn't just talk about recovery, but talks about evolution, about moving towards an organization that is better able to cope with future adversity. And that means we need to reflect on what we've done and to talk about when things are really tough, because often they are really tough and there hasn't been right answers. And where people are having mental health problems, we need to make sure they are identified and get towards evidence-based care, so that actually having a mental health problem doesn't become this big thing where it's career ending. It becomes one of the things that happens as part of the human condition. And where those problems occur, we get some short-term fixes or some long-term care, and then we move on towards something more positive. That's me. Thanks very much. I've happily left plenty of time for questions. So if anyone has questions, please take it away. Well, thank you very much indeed for having me, and I hope the rest of the meeting goes well.
Thank you very much.